Okay, welcome everybody. Thank you for coming. Fully conscious that you've been sitting, listening all day, and I apologize you have more, but I think logistically it makes more sense to just do it today while we're all together. So thank you for those who have shown up for this. Maybe some housekeeping items first. Did any of you bring with you the IRB consent form? This right here. Why don't you just pass them forward and kind of over if we can, and I'll collect them over here if that'll work. Yeah, if you send it to me, that's fine too. And if you don't have it here, you can just email it to me. That will work great. Thank you. So if you are handing me this, I'm making the assumption that you also received the first assignment. Is there anyone who did not receive the email that had the IRB form as well as assignment 1? Okay, I will make sure. All right, you have to hang out after, and I'll make sure I grab your email address and get it sent off to you. Is there anybody who has not yet received the survey to take? You did not receive the survey.
I don't remember being on a vacation.
Okay. Okay, that's fine. Will you just hang out after, and I'll make sure and get your email address, and we'll take care of that. Okay, so consent form survey, assignment 1. Maybe what I'll start with, again, in kind of in the spirit of housekeeping, is I sent this out in an email. The framework for this actually comes from one of the guided projects, the one on the leadership pattern. And so I'm just kind of copying their outline. So you would have a table of contents, you would have an introduction that explains the purpose and desired outcome. If you're wondering what to put for that, it might be useful just to look back at the emails that were sent to you that describe what the project is. I'm not opposed to you copying and pasting from that. I think that will summarize kind of why we're doing this. Because we're doing this as a certification, I guess those of you who are, we have to get it to 30 hours. We're only going to be meeting for 6 hours, which I'm no mathematician, but that should leave right around 24 hours that we have to complete. And so there are other assignments that I'll send out. Some of them will be reading an article. Some of the articles may be from seminaries and institutes. Others may be from academia. But either way, you'll read the article. There may be a couple of guiding questions. On some of them, it's simply read the article and then write some of your thoughts, maybe a summary of it. All of that I'll send out each week as we go on. This is designed to span over 6 weeks. So it would be helpful in the spirit of kind of tracking all of this if you'll do the assignments in the week that you receive the email, if that makes sense. If you haven't done assignment 1 yet, I forgive you, but if you can do it sooner than later, that would be great. Any questions? Yes?
Exactly what is assignment 1? Is it to actually type responses to the questions you have inserted here?
Yes.
Okay.
That's all assignment 1 is, and you don't even need to give me those. I don't need your responses. It's more for you and to go become part of your portfolio. Some of it you may discuss with your supervisors. They're talking about the project, but that's what assignment 1 is responding to those questions that were sent out. And then after we meet today, I'll be sending out an article, an academic article that was one of the original articles that kind of launched the topic we'll be talking about today. You can get a little more information on that. Any other questions, kind of logistically, please?
What do we title it, and if we're setting up the certification and getting it approved? What do we title it?
So what we're focusing on is build capability in the leadership pattern. And so some who sent me an email, I said maybe just call it the Build Capability Project or something like that. I don't know that the title is. I think there can be some variance to that, but something along those lines. Build capability. Any other questions?
It's an administrative.
So I received an email from someone asking if it could be a content mastery one. I think it depends on how you frame it. I think it fits most cleanly under the administrative leadership, and that'll probably make sense as we go along, but there may be some flexibility. I would suggest as we get into this, you can chat with your supervisor and determine that, but in my opinion, that's probably where it fits most cleanly. Anything else? All right, I asked Shad to just offer a prayer for us, and then we'll launch into the training.
Our Father in heaven, we're very grateful for the opportunity that we have to gather today and to be taught and trained on how to build capability in ourselves and in those that we work with in Southern Racing Institutes. We pray that that would reveal to our minds and hearts those things that we could do individually to help do our part to better accomplish the objective that we've been given. And we're grateful for Brother Sharp and for his preparation and talents and the time that he's put in to help us in building capability, and ask that that could occur. And we say these things in the name of Jesus Christ.
Amen. Thank you. Maybe one more kind of contextual point. So how it's going to work is, again, today is the first training, and then the 21st and the 28th will be the other two trainings. And so I'm planning on talking for the first hour of each of those, and then I have kind of an expert in each of the fields coming to take the second hour. And so I'll introduce our other speaker when he gets here today, hoping that he gets here today. So maybe a little bit about me and what triggered my interest in this. So I'm studying at the University of Utah Health Promotion and Education, but I'm specifically interested in psychological health with an emphasis in the workplace and in organizational behavior. I grew up with a dad who owned a business, and so I grew up seeing books on the shelves by Jim Collins, Good to Great, and Talent is Never Enough by John Maxwell, and all these other organizational behavior books. And so I kind of, that piqued my interest, and then I found myself just kind of gravitating towards that. And so there's a professor up at the University of Utah in the Health Promotion and Education Department that has done a number of work site trainings and things like that. And so he and I got talking, and anyway, here we are. So I've finished my coursework, and now for my dissertation, I needed to do a worksite intervention, and so I thought I would try to blend my two loves, which is seminaries and institutes, and sort of this love for organizational behavior. And so that's why we're here right now. I have 5 little boys, and as you know, who are parents, children are entertaining, and they say things that are really funny. I remember one time my little boy, he was scared of the dark, so we got him in a little night light, and we plugged it in, and the next day, hopefully that's not me. The next day, he said, "Please don't plug in the night light." And I was thinking I was doing a good thing as a father, and I said, well why, buddy? And he said, "I see things." And I was like, what? So you know when the night light's there and you can see like there's a shirt or something like that, and he sees the shadows. So kids are funny. One of the other times my wife was, she was saying the prayer at the end of our day, and as she was doing it, her mind went blank. I don't know if you guys have ever had that happen, but her mind went blank, and she said, I wrote it down here, she said, "I prayed that we would have mutual respect and talk to one another as if we were," and then her mind goes blank in that moment. And she's like, "As if we were," and then my 9-year-old, who was 8 at the time, whispers, "Friends, Mom, as if we were friends." And then afterward, he just starts busting up laughing at her, and he's like, "Mom," and I wrote this down, "you were like a quarterback who just passed the ball in the middle of nowhere. Like, it was like an empty desert, Mom, that you threw it." Anyway, so I asked my kids, knowing that they're entertaining, I said, "Boys, what do you want to be when you grow up?" My oldest son, he's grappling right now between NFL football player and Navy SEAL. He's not quite sure which direction he wants to go. My next son, he either wants to be a hunter or a professional soccer player, which is everybody's grapple, I think. And then my other boy wants to either be a cowboy or an Indian. Don't mock that. My other little boy wants to be a ninja, but he calls it an ninja. So he wants to be a ninja. So we started talking about this and kind of what you want to be when you grow up. What I want to look at, though, is kind of careers. I want you to think of the experiences. We go through our training today. Think of your experience and what led you to where you are right now. What led you to a career as a teacher, specifically a career as a seminary or institute teacher. Career by definition means a path or progress through life, or a profession or occupation chosen as one's life work. And this one, career is a verb, more fits my style, move swiftly in an uncontrolled way. That's what career means as a verb. So what I want to talk about today is this idea, what led you to the career that you're in, and kind of this progress through life. The professor who's going to come and talk to us later, this is kind of where his expertise lies, work as a calling, and so we'll get there shortly. But what I want to look at is how we can find greater professional vitality and thriving. I was listening to a TED Talk once, and he was talking about depression, and it was interesting. He said, the opposite of depression is not happiness. He said, the opposite of depression is vitality. And that piqued my interest. And so I started thinking about it, and I started thinking about this idea of vitality. The opposite of job stress or burnout or absenteeism. These are all organizational behavior terms. I don't think it's work happiness. I think it's vitality and strength. And are we finding the fulfillment that we would hope to find in our careers? When we're talking about building capability, again, as one of the elements of the leadership pattern, one of the masters is obviously Stephen Covey. He said, I'm now 76 years old and could easily retire, but I'm not retired, and I don't plan to retire. I don't believe in retirement. Why, people ask me? Simply, I have a life motto. It is live life in crescendo. Living life in crescendo to me means that my most important work is always ahead of me, never behind me. I believe that where much is given, much is required. I have a sacred stewardship to contribute and not retire to leisure. Also, the greatest way to serve my 50 grandkids is not just to love them and tend to their interests and needs, but to be an example of someone who is constantly making a difference in the world. Start living your life in crescendo, and remember, your most important work is ahead of you, not behind you. There is so much more to do, to learn, and to contribute. And so again, at the heart of this idea, and at the heart of our careers, is this desire, hopefully, to progress and to become better. Those of you who have spent some time studying statistics, first of all, I apologize that you've had to endure that. But second of all, what does this graph represent? I'll give you a hint. There's a word on there that should be helpful. Good, class. An outlier. Excellent. So specifically, this is saying, this is the norm, and then there's this guy, right? And that guy's different. And so he's down here, somehow subpar, right? Somehow less than or different than the normal group right here. And so in this case, it's a negative outlier. So if that's the case, then what does this story tell? Nailed it. Good job. So this is a positive outlier. And so I want to talk for a moment about a man named Martin Seligman, who's the father of what's called positive psychology. In 1999, he was the president of the American Psychological Association, and he talked about what kind of motivated him to run for that position and then to impact the rest of his emphasis in his work. So I'm going to read to you a story that he read. In 1999, they had what's called the Positive Psychology Summit. And going into to his tenure, he thought he would look at prevention. But then he decided he wouldn't. And it largely started because of this experience I'm going to read to you. He said, I was weeding in the garden. I'm a rose gardener. And I was weeding with my daughter, Nikki, who turned 5 a couple of weeks before that. And I have to tell you, that even though I write books about kids, I'm not very good with kids. And like most of you, I'm goal-oriented and time-urgent. I was trying to get the weeds out, and Nikki was throwing weeds in the air and running around and dancing. I yelled at her, and she sort of looked at me, and she walked away. And she came back and said, Daddy, I want to talk to you. I said, yeah, Nikki? She said, yeah, Daddy, you may have noticed, but... or you may not have noticed, but do you remember that before I was 5 years old, before my 5th birthday, I was kind of a whiner. I whined every day from the time I was 3 until the time I was 5. And you know, Daddy, on my 5th birthday, I decided I wasn't going to whine anymore. And that was the hardest thing I've ever had to do. And I haven't whined since. And if I can stop whining, you can stop being so grumpy. He says, this was actually an epiphany for me. First, personally, Nikki was exactly right. For 50 years of my life, I've walked around being grouchy and grumpy. And even though I'm surrounded in my life with my wife and my children who are just rays of sunshine, there's no reason for grumpiness. Anything I've done has probably been in spite of it, not because of it. So personally, I decided I was going to change just like Nikki did. And that's the hardest thing I've ever done, by far. I don't know if I've succeeded or not, but I've tried. It doesn't come naturally. And the second thing was about the notion of child rearing. I've been, like many of you, brought up in the school of psychology that says education in child rearing is about repairing weaknesses, about finding what's wrong and correcting it. Now that's ridiculous, given what Nikki had just done. Raising Nikki wasn't about stopping her whining. She decided to do that by herself. Raising Nikki would be about taking the strength that she had just shown, I call it seeing into the soul, naming it, nurturing it, reinforcing it, helping her to lead her life around it and let it buffer against the weaknesses and the vicissitudes. The most important thing, the most general thing I learned was that psychology was half-baked, literally half-baked. We had baked the part about mental illness. We had baked the part about repair of damage, but that's only half of it. The other side, unbaked, the side of strength, the side that we're good at. And so that's kind of the premise of where I want to take this. In that same address, he said before World War II, psychologists had three kind of major missions. Number one, curing mental illness. Number two, making the lives of all people stronger, happier, more productive, more fulfilling. Number three, nurturing and identifying genius, nurturing and identifying high talent. But after World War II, these two sort of went away, and this became the central focus. Why? Well, because of certain bills that were passed that allowed psychologists to make a living studying mental illness. And so he talks about that, and he talks about kind of the shift that happened. And so in 1999, again, there was this Positive Psychology Summit, and all of these different scholars came together. One of them that was there was a man named Dr. Fred Luthans. He was an organizational behavior, kind of a pioneer in the field of organizational behavior, and he comes in and he hears this, and he says, this is exactly what the business world needs. And so he takes these principles of positive psychology, and he takes them to organizational behavior that studies, among other things, employees' attitudes and behaviors, well-being, job stress, work engagement, productivity, absenteeism, turnover, work happiness, all of those different ideas, and then he coins the term positive organizational behavior. So in essence, what he does is he takes positive psychology and plants it right in the middle of organizational behavior. Now, let me just read the quote. He says, its primary interest is positively oriented human strengths and psychological capacities that can be measured, developed, and effectively managed for performance improvement in today's workplace. And so that's where we kind of settle with this. The critics would suggest that positive organizational behavior and positive psychology is just sort of a rehashing of self-help books and you know, sort of the positive mental attitude thinking, and it's just kind of a rehashing of that. But in order to make it a rigorous discipline, there were three criteria. Number one, it must be based on theory, research, and valid measurement. Number two, it must be state-like and thus be open to development. And number three, it must have a performance impact. So for them to include a construct as part of this positive organizational behavior, it had to meet these criteria. So when it says state-like, this is what it's talking about. A trait is very stable, fixed. It's sort of, we would say it's genetically wired into us. It's kind of who we are. Trait-like would be the big five personality traits, where they are pretty solid, but there can be some variation. Positive states are momentary and very changeable, just kind of feelings, emotions that we feel. So state-like is somewhere in between that, if that makes sense. So it's something that can be changed. And so with that, looking at capital, traditional economic capital is what do you have? right? Money, finances, tangible assets, etc. Human capital is what do you know? This is the people side of it. Social capital is who you know and the networks. And so what he did is, in the spirit of positive organizational behavior, he coined this idea of psychological capital, which has 4 constructs that meet those criteria that I mentioned. Confidence, optimism, hope, and resilience. And so I'm just kind of unloading on you, and you feel that. And again, I'm conscious that you just sat, for a long time. But to set up the rest of this time, I have to kind of at least give you the framework of what we're looking at. So I want to just briefly look at each of these 4. And maybe I'll ask my friend Chris to read this first one so you hear a different voice.
Ryan,
Yes,
are
please.
these going to be available to us for access?
Yeah, I can make them available.
And then the other thing, do you want the
clicker?
The clicker?
You don't like me going back and forth? I'm just kidding.
No, not really.
Okay,
Do you want-
yes, I'll take your clicker. Thank you.
No, I'm just saying if you want.
No,
to
I
use
would love
this.
it, thank you. Okay, Chris, will you read this one for us?
Both paragraphs.
Yes, please.
The first of the 4 core capacities has been defined as one's conviction or confidence about his or her abilities to mobilize the motivation, cognitive resources, and courses of action needed to successfully execute a specific task within a given context.
That was taken from an academic article, if you could imagine, from the language there. Okay, go ahead.
Self-efficacy beliefs determine how people feel, think, motivate themselves, and behave. Such beliefs produce these diverse effects through 4 major processes. They include cognitive, motivational, affective, and selection processes.
So in essence, self-efficacy is how confident do I feel in my ability to accomplish a certain task. So in our profession, how confident do I feel in standing before a group of teenagers and teaching them from the scriptures? Right? In that specific task, how much confidence do I have? The second construct is hope, and at the heart of it is what some scholars have called willpower or way power. In other words, it's focused on individuals' efforts toward attaining their personal goals and then making conscious efforts to produce a pathway to achieve it. And so this is, I've got a goal and I feel confident I can do it, but the hope element, it's not just I hope that this happens, I hope I succeed. Hope is that you've created a pathway to accomplish that. And we'll talk a lot more about that in one of our other sessions. But that's the second construct. The third, optimism, making an internal, relatively stable and global attribution regarding positive events such as goal achievement, and external, relatively unstable and specific cause for negative events like a failed attempt at reaching a goal. In other words, if I succeed at something, if I'm optimistic, I can say I succeeded because I did this, and this, and you can kind of spell it out. If I didn't exceed, then I can still identify some things that it's different than just making an excuse, but it's this idea that I didn't succeed because I should have done this differently, or I should have done that differently. And so, again, that's the third construct. And the fourth is resilience. Some scholars have defined resilience simply in terms of the ability to sort of bounce back after adversity, after a hard thing happens to them. My dissertation chair is named Glenn Richardson, and I think he'll be here next time. If not next time, it'll be on the 28th. But his area of expertise is on resilience and what he calls the resiliency process. And so what he suggests is that an individual improves their resiliency and successful progression through a disruption and reintegration process. So this is what he developed and how he sort of makes this point. So you're at the comfort zone, you're at this, he calls it homeostasis, and then something happens, something disrupts it. And then there's this disruption, and then you come down here, and then you have this moment of resonation or quickening, he calls it. And you have that moment where you begin to change your thought process. And you're trying to process the event that happens. And so then he gets to the reintegration side, where some people, after a disruptive event, come back and they're not the same as they were before. Right? It's affected them. Maybe they're more bitter, angry, hurt. It somehow has affected them, so they reintegrate, but with loss. it's sort of had permanent damage on these individuals. A second option is you reintegrate kind of back to where you started, back to that status quo, the comfort zone that you began with. You had a hard thing and you come back and you're like, okay, that's all right, and you sort of get back at the level that you were. And the ideal is this idea of resilient reintegration. And I think we can probably relate to that. After you go through a challenging situation, you come back and you're stronger. You're better, and it's helped develop who you are. Kind of as a sidebar, I'm going to write an article on what Elder President Nelson called resilient faith. And kind of, it's interesting to use this model, and you know, here we are in a day where the youth are having, you know, and young adults are having crises of faith, and they're having these challenges that come, and that disrupts them. And they're questioning things, and they're questioning their own experiences, they're questioning what their parents told them, they're questioning their own faith, they're questioning their own testimony, you know, what do I believe? And so they're disruptive, and then they sort of have this moment. And obviously there are some who reintegrate, but with loss. They're bitter, they're angry, you know, some just completely leave altogether. And there are some who come back, and they sort of come back where they initially were. And then there are others who come back from those crises of faith, and they're stronger, their testimonies are deeper, and they're better than they were before, and they found this newfound strength through that process. Okay, I've just unloaded on you, and I get that. Please.
Could you clarify for me the difference between hope and optimism?
Yeah. So the way that the scholars would suggest is hope, in this sense, is the pathway towards achieving a goal. So for example, and again, we'll go into more detail on this in one of the next trainings, but for example, if I have a goal to exercise in the morning, well, the hope element would be creating a pathway to accomplish that. So in my case, you know, I'll leave early in the morning, and I'll lay out my exercise clothes, and I'll lay out my keys and my suit and everything like that, so that I really don't have an excuse. I can wake up, it's there, I've got my keys ready, I've got my water bottle ready, and I can go. Does that make sense? So that's the hope element. Optimism is in our minds kind of what we're attributing success to. So if I'm optimistic using this definition, and I've succeeded at something, then I can identify things that I did to find success in that. So if I'm teaching a class, I can say that activity went well because, well, I prepared it like this, and I had a question out for the students, and you can attribute it to some specific things. And on the other side of that, if something didn't go well, I can attribute it to, let's just say it was fourth period, it was homecoming week, and there were some other events that were happening, and I didn't, you know, I didn't prepare keeping that in mind to have a successful experience. Does that make sense? Good question. Again, I've unloaded. Any other questions, comments, thoughts on that? So those are the four constructs. So self-efficacy, hope, optimism, and resilience. Those are the four constructs that make up this idea of psychological capital. We good? Can we do some push-ups or something? Go ahead.
Just one more time. When you had, I think, economic capital, human capital, social capital, you had a little catchphrase underneath them that I thought was helpful. What you have. What was the one for the psychological capital?
So that was who you are.
Gotcha.
Yeah, so economic, what do you have? Human capital, what do you know? Social capital, who do you know? Psychological is who you are. And so that's this idea, again, to kind of bring it full circle, and hopefully where we find some help within our seminaries and institutes' careers is who we are professionally ought to change, and we ought to be developing as we have more and more experiences. You know, we ought to be more effective teachers and administrators now than we have been before, and we ought to be more effective next year and the following year. And it's this idea that Stephen Covey talked about, this idea of living and having a career in crescendo. And so the hope that I have is that as we look at psychological capital, and as we try to understand what it is, and as we try to apply some of the principles that led to it, that we can find success in our career. And so that sort of leads to what's happened so far in the literature. So psychological capital has been positively connected to all of these things. So employees' attitudes, a decreased level of job stress, employee behavior, employee satisfaction and fulfillment, job performance and productivity, safety, commitment to organizational missions, well-being, organizational identity, and citizenship, perceived supervisor support, and work happiness. So if you look at all the literature, flirting with 100 different articles now from all over the world, these are some of the things that they've said. The greater the psychological capital we're finding, the greater are these outcomes. And so the survey that you took is the exact survey that they're using to determine all of these things. And so it's been studied all over the world. Scholars from all over sort of latching onto this. And it's still, as far as disciplines go, it's still in its relative infancy. It's still kind of growing out. It began, 2002 was the first article that was published that started looking at this idea of psychological capital. There's a guy named Sean Aker who wrote the book, The Happiness Advantage. Have any of you read this? Are you familiar with this guy? He gave a TED Talk that's very popular. He was a Harvard professor and taught a class on positive psychology. And these became the most popular classes at Harvard. He's now since gone out and he does consulting with businesses. But this is what he said. He said, we think if I just get the raise or hit the next sales target, I'll be happy. If I can just get that next good grade, I'll be happy. If I lose that 5 pounds, I'll be happy, and so on. Success first and happiness second. The only problem is that this formula is broken. If success causes happiness, then every employee who gets a promotion, every student who receives an acceptance letter, everyone who has ever accomplished a goal of any kind should be happy. But with each victory, our goalposts of success keep getting pushed further and further out, so that happiness gets pushed over the horizon. Even more important, the formula is broken because it's backward. More than a decade of groundbreaking research in the field of positive psychology and neuroscience has proven in no uncertain terms that the relationship between success and happiness works the other way around. Thanks to this cutting-edge science, we now know that happiness is the precursor to success, not merely the result, and that happiness and optimism actually fuel performance and achievement, giving us the competitive advantage that I call the happiness, or competitive edge that I call the happiness advantage. So it's this idea that if I'm happier, if I have greater vitality, then I'm going to be more successful, more productive. And there is just scores of research surrounding this, which is innate, right? We sort of feel that, I think we know it, but research now is showing that time and time again. Different studies have shown that, the question is asked, what determines happiness? And so, we talk nature and nurture, and we talk biology, and we talk all of these different things. And the reality is, from all the studies that have come, everyone sort of concedes that there is a biological set point. And that set point contributes to 50% of our happiness. And then there are other things. There are circumstances that can influence it. And then there are other activities, intentional activities that we can do that make up the other 40%. And so what we look at then is I can control about 50% of my level of happiness. And what I want to look at now is how do we take the set point and try to drive that into finding more happiness and fulfillment in the workplace. There were a series of books written by a guy named Marcus Buckingham and co-authored with others. The first one was First Break All the Rules, and the second one was Now Discover Your Strengths. Have any of you heard of the Gallup Strengths Finder and those sorts of things? So it tells you these are some of the strengths that you have. The argument that they make, in fact, the question that was asked of 1.7 million employees in 101 companies from 63 countries was at work, do you have the opportunity to do what you do best every day? Now, if you're on my faculty, we just talked about this yesterday, so you're not allowed to answer this. What percentage of employees from this group do you think answered strongly agree or yes to, at work, I have the opportunity to do what I do best every day? It's higher than 5, fortunately.
Can I first ask, how did you determine How did everybody determine what they do best?
So they've gone through, well, I mean, I think for the question, when it was sent out to this big group, it was up to them to determine. Do you feel like you're using your greatest strengths every day? Yeah, good question. So now with that solid foundation, what percentage do you think?
15, 10 to 15.
So it was even a little higher, it was 20%. So 20% of these people felt like they have an opportunity at work to do what they do best. Now that's not awesome, because again, I'm no mathematician, but if 20% said yes, right around 80% would have said no. And if I'm spending a third of my life in the workplace, I want to do something that's utilizing strength, that's allowing me to find, again, greater fulfillment. And so that's where I want to kind of spend the next few minutes here. If you're looking at our career, and you're looking at if these are the skills that we have as teachers, and this, you know, a number 6, that means, okay, that's good enough. And if number 10 means that's great, if I'm going in to meet with the supervisor or whatever, and I'm trying to determine, or if I'm setting my own goals, you know, where do I spend my time, where do I place my emphasis? These are called signature strengths using this language. And that one down there is a fatal flaw or a blinding beam. So if you look at this idea, normally what we would say is we would look and say, well, we need to look at those weaknesses. Okay, so looking at these weaknesses, how can we make those better? How can we get those up to sort of this par, to this good range? But what the research says is there are some things, if it's this fatal flaw or if it's a blinding beam, there are some things that are going to need to require attention, right? But rather than spending our time trying to just become mediocre, because if I get those up there and everything's sort of hovering right around 6, then that makes us average. So rather than that, why don't we look at where our natural strengths are and try to play to those strengths as often as possible? And if I do that, then I become inherently more effective. And if I become more effective, I'm using my strengths more, I'm going to find greater fulfillment in my work. I'm going to be more productive. I'm going to be happier. I'm going to have more energy because I'm doing something that comes naturally to me. I'm utilizing those strengths that are already there. Does that make sense? Questions, comments on this stuff? Okay, so here's where I want to spend now the last part. I want to go back to kind of where we started with this, and we were talking about strengths. The hope is that you got into teaching, and I got into teaching because we feel like that's a strength, that you feel like you're an effective teacher. And specifically, you got into this because you felt like it was a strength to teach religion to a group of youth. And if that's the case, then that's a great starting point. The I guess, follow-up question that I would ask is, how often in our preparations and in the classroom are we playing to our strengths in our lesson prep? You know what I mean? I feel like sometimes we prepare a lesson without keeping in mind the strengths that you naturally have as a teacher. And all of us have different strengths. And sometimes we may hear someone else's lesson and try to do what they did, or sometimes you may be trying something new, and that's great. But again, the question that I would just encourage you to ask yourself is, how often are we playing to those strengths while we're in the classroom, or while we're talking to leaders and parents and things like that? One more thought, and then I'm going to stop talking and get some thoughts from you all. Again, it's not normally going to be like this, so in your mind you're like, this is horrible. I just endured a whole bunch of talking all day. Okay, it's not normally going to be like that. I had to at least lay the framework for this. With regard to self-efficacy, and that's kind of what I want to just end with here, self-efficacy is again the idea of how confident am I that I can fulfill a specific task. So self-efficacy can be improved. So again, we can find improvement in our psychological capital, first of all, by playing to our strengths. Second of all, we can find improvement as we look at some of these things. So I want you to think about your own experiences and maybe how you've gained greater confidence in doing your job by any one of these 4. You picking up what I'm putting down? Good, thank you. Performance accomplishments. So your own personal successful experiences. So if I successfully complete a task, then I'm probably going to have greater confidence that I can successfully complete that task again. Number 2, vicarious experiences. I've observed someone else successfully completing that task, and so now I've seen it, and so now I can be more effective in my efforts to do that. Number 3, verbal persuasion. Somebody gives me encouraging words. Somebody gives me constructive feedback. And that may boost my confidence as I go in to teach a class or give a talk or something like that. And then finally, physiological states. Your own personal emotional state can impact your self-efficacy positively or negatively. The way in which we interpret and respond to these emotions can improve self-efficacy. Okay, so now, I want you to look at this list. And I want you to think of your own experiences in the classroom, and I want you to think of how you gain greater confidence in doing your job by any one of these 4, and I would love to hear kind of what it was like and how you grew from it. Dan, thank you.
I would have to say, for me, the physiological state probably affects me more than the other 3. But when my own personal emotional state is intact, I would probably say performance, what I've done in the past, probably weighs the most. Verbal persuasion is probably the least, for me.
So good pep talk beforehand doesn't get you.
Doesn't do much for me.
Yeah, thank you, Dan. Others? Other experiences that you've had, or times when maybe you've seen this actually work, where one of these things has given you greater confidence?
Some vicarious experiences. Sometimes, you know, in that February, March time period, I found it really helpful to go sit in someone else's classroom, and it just kind of revitalizes some things that you know, reinforces some things that you realize really are making a difference, maybe helps you see things you want to do differently, but I think that has been helpful. Please.
When I was first evaluated by somebody in Salt Lake, afterwards, sat down and said, "Brother Raleigh, that was awesome. For 10 years ago, we don't teach like that in CES." And I thought, okay. But for me, that was an interesting experience to have that kind of a verbal, you know, checkpoint for me to then start to go through some of these, you know, the psychological part of it. How am I going to deal with this? And then I had to gain some experience on, well, what's the way to teach? So probably for everybody, it's a different starting point.
Right.
That then takes you into all of the other things, because all of those realistically are part of, you know, how we do.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Brian, I have a question about one of them to see if I'm thinking of it clearly. With the physiological state, I don't know what it is, but maybe some of you felt this. I can sometimes go into a lesson, and at the beginning, there's sometimes where I am so excited, and I just have such confidence that it's going to go well. Would that be because I've had past performance accomplishments with that, or? But it is like a physiological state. Like you can almost feel like this is going to be good today.
Right, and you know, I mean, I will defer to you, the therapist, but here's my thought. So my experience has been it's usually a blending of them, and so I think it, you know, my immediate response would be both. From my own experience, anyway, is you that confidence often comes from past experiences, and sometimes that confidence comes from observing somebody else doing it and thinking, what a great idea that is. I'm going to go in and try to apply that as well. Yeah, please.
So when I have a class that's a little bit harder behaviorally.
Wait, you have those?
Just one or two.
Okay,
But hypothetically,
yeah.
right? And I start to think that, like, I'll ask a question nobody answers, or it's kind of that awkward, and I start to think that they're not a very good class, or they're just really hard. Then my lessons always just bomb in that class. And if I have a class that I just believe in, then almost if I don't have a good lesson prepared, it goes well. And so I can see how, when I believe in a class, it usually goes well, and when I don't have trust in the class, it usually doesn't.
Isn't that interesting? And when we talk about, you know, to tie it into Gospel Teaching and Learning Handbook, we talk about trusting the students and having that confidence, and then I think that absolutely fits in. Great thought. Sean?
I got a question. You made me think about this. The physiological states, going into a classroom with that kind of confidence, is that a physiological state, or is that just greater self-efficacy? What is it, you know? Do those first three lead to the fourth, or is that fourth thing just, is it something completely different? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think so. So I mean, I think that it's one of the things that have been identified that improves self-efficacy. And so I think it's a part of it. You know what I mean? So if I go in and I have this, I'm feeling physiologically, I'm emotionally charged and ready for it, I think that is part of self-efficacy. So I don't think you split hairs here. I think it's the same. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I just would, yeah, what would a definition be for an emotional state? Is it confidence in what I'm doing, or just confidence in me, or?
I think how you're feeling and, yeah, please.
Having gone through bouts of depression in my own life, I can tell you that when my emotional state is not good, the other three just, it's like they're dragging through mud. There is an emotional state that does affect not only how you interpret what is happening, but also how you are able to achieve self-efficacy during that.
Right.
And so, to me, the emotional state also has, and I don't know if we're talking biological or chemical, but there is part of that too, that sometimes you can be doing great, but if your emotional state is not where you need to be, like if you've been sick and you're just fatigued, that can affect the others as well.
Absolutely, and what's interesting is another kind of field of research that I've become intrigued with is this idea of work-life balance, or some scholars are calling it four-way wins, kind of finding that balance between, because if things aren't right at home, you know, I'm coming to work, and not only teaching suffers, but my motivation to study or write or whatever, it's all impacted. And so I think absolutely it affects all of those areas. Any other thoughts, please, Todd?
Do you see any adaptation to this model for our specific field? For example, I think I've gone in sometimes feeling very confident, positive, and just crash. And just the opposite, sometimes I've gone in feeling very needy, and because we have this belief of humility and relying on the Lord, and obviously from a worldly perspective that may not be part of the model. So how do you see those relating, blending?
So I can share some thoughts, but you've been thinking about it for a few minutes. Tell me where you're.
Well, I'm just wondering if sometimes the confidence of the world that leads to success, say to business or to sale, can be damning in the classroom. I don't think often.
Right.
You know, but.
So I guess to try to bridge that. So we talked about the Gospel Teaching Learning Handbook with regard to trusting the students earlier. One of those elements is trusting, you know, the Spirit, and trusting that the Savior is going to do so, and trusting in the Scriptures.
Having confidence in those.
Yeah, so I think the efficacy is in my ability to
be an instrument in His hands.
Yeah. To teach the Scriptures. I've paid the price in the left. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I think there absolutely could be some carryover there, Patrick.
I was going to say, in that scenario, remember 10% of it was circumstance on there too. In other words, you can walk into a class and feel the self-efficacy, but it doesn't mean you're going to have a hit home run lesson. You feel it, but you can only control you.
Right.
I don't know if that made sense. In other words, just because I feel like I'm doing good or will do good, it depends on how other circumstances too. And I can still continue to go through those circumstances and still try that.
Right. Yeah.
There's other things involved with not just feeling good about it.
Yeah. Thank you. Other thoughts?
And how do you balance it? You do your job, you pay the price, you walk into it really excited, and it happens to be homecoming week, and it totally tanks. You then just say, oh, that's 10%, I'm good.
Resilience. Resilience, there you go. Yeah, so I think it all factors in, and obviously, environment, I think, was that 10%, and so the environment is going to impact it, right? If the students are thinking about their date on Friday night, getting them into the Word may take a little more work, and you may have to adjust some things for it.
I think the thing with what we do is we need to be fully integrated with the Spirit. So it's not a separate component.
Right.
It's all part of the same thing.
Yeah.
So my confidence in the lesson that I prepared is not based on the fact that I'm a genius and prepared a wonderful lesson, as much as it is that I prepared by the Spirit and I feel good. So I don't want to separate the two things.
Yeah.
I want the Spirit just to be integrated into who I am and what I do.
Absolutely, and that, you know, we started with this, so maybe we can wrap up with this. That's this idea of what the brethren have put together for our purposes of the leadership pattern. It's act under the direction of the Spirit, align with the brethren, lead like the Savior. And then we have these talents that we can develop, and the one that we're talking about is building capability. So again, the submission, and I realize I unloaded for like 20 minutes straight without even letting you draw breath, and I'm sorry for that, and I won't do it again, I promise. But I sort of had to lay out the framework of everything we're going to look at moving forward. But I hope it makes sense that the framework then is, it's framed in a positive psychology standpoint, where it's saying studying what's right and what's good is at least equally as valuable as studying what's wrong and what's not working. And I think we can all probably, that resonates with us, and we've had experiences with it. So now putting that in our jobs, studying those who are thriving and finding that vitality and fulfillment in work, we ought to be able to learn from that. And so the construct that we're looking at for our purposes is called psychological capital, which again has the issue. We do a pop quiz, see if you can get them. Okay, so there's 4 of them. They are self-efficacy, hope, nailed it. So we spent the last part of our time talking about self-efficacy today. We talked about using our strengths. Again, the hope is, as part of this 6-week experience, by studying, by learning, by practicing, this isn't just teaching, because we don't teach a lot in the summer. Right? Part of our job is paying a price, learning, studying, writing, working on all these different things. So that's part of this. And so the hope is that by applying some of these things that we're learning, we'll have greater confidence in our ability to sit down with an 8-hour day and make it productive, right? In the summertime, where you're not going out and teaching, you just have an 8-hour slot to get in and study and do whatever you need to do to improve. And in so doing, the idea is that we're going to progress, and we're going to develop, and we're going to feel more confident, and we're going to figure out ways with that hope element that we can accomplish the things that we've set out to do. And with, again, the optimism that I can control some of these things, and when you have one of those experiences where you feel like you wasted 4 hours or something like that, you can bounce back, and we can use that to learn and become better and become stronger. And so that's the idea, that's the concept that we're looking at. Again, I'm going to send you, probably later tonight or tomorrow morning, one of the articles that lays all this out, and I think that'll help clarify some things for you. But I hope that's helpful. What I want to do now, though, is just take kind of a standing break. I think there's a restroom around the corner, a drinking fountain, and we'll get Dr. Thompson set up here. So go ahead and take a break, and then we'll hit part 2.
Ryan Sharp.